Welcome to the channel where time slows down and stories help you drift away. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it right now? If this brings you peace, subscribe and join thousands falling asleep to the rhythm of the earth. Now close your eyes. Let the stillness begin. Before earth had a name, before oceans had formed, before time began as we know it, there was only silence in the darkness. Space stretched in every direction, with no sky and no ground. It was not empty, but filled with dust left behind by stars that had lived and died long before the sun was born. These tiny particles floated across the cold vastness of space for millions of years, carried by gravity and guided by nothing but the silent breath of the universe. This dust was ancient. It held carbon and oxygen and iron and gold. It was made from the cores of massive stars that had burned until they could no longer hold themselves together. When those stars collapsed, they exploded and scattered their insides across the galaxy. Every grain of dust was a memory of that explosion, a fragment of a star that had once shone bright and now drifted cold and silent, waiting to become something new. Over time, in a quiet region of our galaxy, that cloud of dust began to gather. It pulled itself inward, slowly, almost without motion at first. But gravity does not rush. It only waits and draws and holds. As the cloud collapsed, the particles came closer together. They began to spin. The motion formed a spiral, and at the center of that spiral, a new star began to form. This would become our sun, a ball of light that would one day warm the surface of a blue planet that did not yet exist. Around the forming sun, the remaining dust and gas flattened into a wide disk. Within that spinning disk, collisions began. Dust stuck to dust. Pebbles grew into rocks, rocks into boulders, boulders into mountain-sized bodies. They crashed into each other again and again, sometimes shattering, sometimes merging. This was the beginning of the solar system, a place that would hold the planet's moons and asteroids, all circling the sun in long, graceful paths. In one small part of this disk, a world was starting to form. It did not begin with a shape or a name. It began as a clump of rock and metal, gathering more mass with each impact. Heat built up inside as more material fell in. The surface boiled, the core melted. The young planet was a sphere of fire, spinning through the darkness, lit only by the glow of molten stone. This was Earth in its earliest form, a planet not yet cooled, a world without air or ocean, a place where time had just begun. The early Earth was not peaceful. Space around it was crowded with debris. Rocks the size of mountains flew past its mist. Others collided. One of those collisions was not like the rest. A body roughly the size of Mars struck the young Earth at an angle. The force of that impact shook the planet to its core. A piece of Earth was thrown into orbit, and from that debris the moon was born. It formed quickly and remained close, casting its pull on the planet below and slowing the Earth's spin. From that moment on, Earth would never be alone. The planet remained molten for millions of years. Volcanoes erupted constantly. The sky was filled with smoke and ash. There was no water yet, no clouds, no continents. But inside, the chaos, slow changes were happening. The core separated into layers. Iron sank to the center. Lighter materials rose to the surface. A crust began to form, thin and cracked, but strong enough to hold shape. Water did not arrive all at once. Some of it was already present in the rocks that made up Earth, but much more may have come from the sky. Icy comets and asteroids carried water as they traveled through space. When they struck the Earth, their ice melted and turned to steam. That steam filled the sky and slowly began to cool. Clouds formed. Rain began to fall. Not for hours or days, but for thousands of years. Rain that never stopped. Rain that cooled the surface. Rain that filled the first oceans. As the planet cooled, the surface hardened. The oceans spread. The air thickened. Lightning struck across dark skies. Winds howled through empty valleys. And still the moon circled above, pulling gently on the seas and shaping the rhythm of tides, even before life had begun. All of this happened before there were people, before animals, or forests, or flowers, before any eye could witness the beauty that was forming. Earth was becoming a home, shaped by fire, cooled by water, guided by gravity, fed by stardust. And even now, deep in your bones, in your blood, and in your breath, that story continues. The iron in your blood was made in a star. The water you drink came from comets and clouds. The ground you walk on was once molten rock. You are not separate from the earth. You are a piece of its long memory, a moment in its quiet unfolding, a tide in its great rhythm. And the story has only just begun. Earth did not begin as a calm world. It began in fire and impact and silence. After the gathering of dust and rock and the birth of the moon, the surface of the planet remained unstable. The air was thick with gas, and the crust was thin like cracked glass floating on a sea of molten rock. Volcanoes lit the horizon. Lava spread across the surface without rest. The planet glowed from within and churned like a living fire. This early stage of Earth was a time of constant change. New rock formed as lava cooled. Then it was broken and melted again. There were no oceans yet, no blue sky, only steam and smoke and shifting heat. The moon above was closer than it is today. It appeared huge in the sky, and its pull on the molten surface was strong. It slowed the Earth's rotation and began to establish the first rhythm of day and night. Time was still, young but already beginning to take form. The core of the Earth separated during these years. Heavy elements, like iron and nickel, sank inward, forming a dense center. Around it, the outer core remained molten. This movement of hot metal created one of the planet's most important features, a magnetic field, invisible but powerful. This field began to protect the surface from solar winds and radiation. It was the first shield, the beginning of safety, the force that would one day allow life to survive. Above, the hot ground gases were rising. Carbon dioxide, sulfur, steam, and traces of other elements began to form a primitive atmosphere. It was thick and full of heat. The sky was red and yellow, with clouds that never cleared. But within this storm, the ingredients for future air were already gathering. And through the endless eruptions, gases continued to rise and fill the sky. With the raw materials of breath, comets and asteroids still rained down upon the Earth. Some carried water, some carried carbon. Each impact added to the growing mass of the planet. Some struck with so much force that they melted part of the crust. Others left behind minerals, and ice. Every collision was part of the shaping process, not destruction, but formation, not an end, but a beginning. The land that formed during this period was not like the continents we know now. It was broken into small fragments, islands of rock floating on a sea of lava. These early pieces would eventually shift and combine, driven by forces deep below the surface. The movement of molten rock created pressure. That pressure pushed upward. Ridges and rifts formed. Earthquakes rolled through the crust. The land moved like slow breath, rising and falling with unseen force. As water began to appear more often, something remarkable started to happen. Pools formed in low areas. Rain collected in cracks and craters. Steam rose and fell again. Lakes became larger. Valleys filled. Oceans were beginning to form. Not all at once, but drop by drop over thousands of years. The hot earth cooled slowly. The surface thickened. The crust became stronger. The lava still flowed, but it began to be covered by stone and by water. That interaction between water and rock created the first cycle. Rain fell, rivers formed, rocks broke down, sediments gathered. These small particles settled into layers. The planet was learning how to wear itself down and build itself up again. This was not a process of hours or days. It was the quiet work of time, measured not in moments but in movement. The sky above began to change too. The thick steam thinned. The heat of the sun met the rising gases. Light filtered through for the first time, and slowly the red haze began to shift toward blue. There was still no oxygen to breathe, but nitrogen and carbon dioxide were present. The sky was beginning to open. The surface was beginning to cool, and the first signs of stability were starting to form. Deep below the surface, the planet was still alive. The mantle flowed like soft rock. The core burned hotter than the sun's surface. The outer layers cracked and drifted. But from that motion came order. The planet was forming its layers: crust, mantle, core. Surface, sky, sea. Space was giving way to structure, and Earth was learning to hold its shape. Even in this time of fire and collision, the foundation for life was being prepared. Water pooled in basins, minerals dissolved into it, lightning struck across the sky. Volcanoes released gases that mixed with the early sea. These were the building blocks, the chemistry of life not yet alive but waiting. The moon above never stopped circling. Its gravity shaped the new oceans, created the first tides, pulled on the crust, helped slow the Earth's rotation. The days began to lengthen. The rhythm became steady. A cycle began. The planet was finding balance. And all the while, the story of Earth continued to unfold, not in chaos, but in pattern, not in sudden creation, but in quiet transformation. Layer by layer, the planet was forming. Fire cooled, rock shifted, water flowed, air thickened. And in the silence between collisions, the world began to prepare for something more. It would not happen quickly. Life was still far away. But the stage was set. The curtain was rising, and the planet was ready. The fire had not vanished, but it had begun to sleep. Beneath the surface, the planet still burned and boiled, but above the crust, something new was settling into place. The Earth had cooled enough to hold its shape. The violent glow of molten rock had softened. The crust had thickened. The endless rain that had fallen for thousands of years began to gather and rest. Oceans were forming not as single bodies, but as connected basins where water could find stillness and the earth could begin to reflect the sky. The water that now spread across the planet came from many places. Some of it had been locked inside the minerals that made up the earth itself. Some arrived through the icy hearts of comets and asteroids, and some may have come from deep within the mantle, pushed upward through volcanic breath. However it came, the result was the same. The world began to shine with water. Not puddles or streams, but vast oceans, deep basins that would become the lungs of the planet, the birthplace of tides, and eventually the home of life. At first, the oceans boiled beneath the still hot sky. Steam rose and fell again in an endless cycle. But as the planet cooled further, the vapor began to clear. The air changed slowly. Gases from volcanoes filled the atmosphere. There was carbon dioxide and nitrogen and water vapor. Still no oxygen. Still no breath to share. But the sky had formed. The pressure thickened. Winds began to blow across the surface. Clouds formed in layers, and light broke through them, scattering into color. The first blue skies were not the same as the ones we know now. They were darker, heavier, and still filled with haze. But when sunlight touched the cooling water, the world began to glow. The surface that had once been fire and rock was now water and cloud. The transformation was quiet and vast. The earth had become something rare, a planet with oceans and sky. A body that could hold its heat and let it go again. A place where storms could form and rest could follow. Beneath the waves, the land continued to shift. The crust broke apart and moved in slow directions. These early movements were the beginning of tectonic drift, the gentle rearranging of the Earth's surface that would one day form continents and mountains. For now, there were only fragments, floating plates of crust that collided, sank, or rose depending on their weight and heat. This drifting was not fast, but it was constant, and with each movement, valleys were formed. Ridges stretched along the ocean floor, deep trenches opened. These underwater shapes would become the structure for future oceans. Basins for tides, corridors for currents. As the earth cooled, the moon continued its watch. Its gravity pulled at the young oceans. Tides began to move slowly at first, but growing stronger. The rising and falling of water shaped the shoreline, carved patterns into the land, and taught the sea how to breathe. The moon's influence stretched not only across the surface, but also deep into the ocean itself. Even then, even before life, there was rhythm, there was pattern, there was motion that had meaning. The air above the sea carried gases from the water and gases from the volcanoes. There were storms, powerful and wild, with lightning that reached across the sky and wind that moved with unmeasured strength. These storms helped mix the elements. Lightning struck the surface of the water and broke molecules apart. The air and sea began to interact with chemistry. Carbon mixed with metal, water mixed with sulfur. The building blocks of life were forming, not in silence, but in thunder. The energy of the planet was not idle. It worked without pause. In the shallows near volcanic vents, the water was warm and rich with minerals. These vents released heat and gases from deep within the earth. They created pockets of life-making potential. Here, in the heat, protected from sunlight, the first complex molecules may have come together. Chains of carbon, loops of proteins, the early steps toward cells. These were not living things yet, but they moved, they reacted, they changed. The ocean was becoming more than water. It was becoming memory. The sky began to show its colors. As the carbon dioxide thickened, the sunlight filtered differently. The sunrises were red, and the afternoons glowed in orange haze. The storms painted the horizon with dark blues and deep shadows. The clouds moved slowly at high altitudes. The earth was learning how to hold light, how to reflect it, how to carry it across the ocean's skin. With cooling came balance. The fires below continued to burn, but the surface found a rhythm. There were no seasons yet, no weather patterns as we know them, but the foundations were there. Water evaporated, clouds formed, rain returned, rivers flowed across the land, lakes gathered in low places, and the ocean, the great ocean, stretched like a mirror across the curve of the planet. There were no eyes to see it, no ears to hear the waves, but the beauty was there. The planet had become a canvas of water and air, of light and motion. It held heat by day and released it by night. It circled the sun in a gentle path. It tilted slowly on its axis. It turned beneath the moon's pull. It was no longer a fireball. It was a world, and still it waited for the spark that would turn chemistry into life, waited for the breath that would shift the sky, waited for the moment when stillness would give way to motion from within. But already the stage was set. The fire had softened, the ocean had opened, the sky had cleared, and the rhythm of the earth had begun. The oceans had settled into their basins, and the sky had formed above them, but still the earth was quiet. The water was deep and dark, and still lifeless. Yet even in this silence, something new was beginning to stir. The planet had cooled and found its shape. It had gathered its layers. It had softened the fire. And now it was ready for the next change, not in the shape of land or sea, but in the breath of the world itself. Life as we know it. There was carbon dioxide and water vapor. There was methane and ammonia, but there was no oxygen, no air to breathe. The skies were thick and warm. The light of the sun filtered through slowly, and below the clouds the surface remained empty. But deep in the ocean, near cracks in the seafloor, warmth continued to rise. Chemical-rich water flowed upward from within the earth. Around these vents, new molecules began to take shape. These molecules were not alive, but they moved, they reacted, they bonded and broke apart and formed again. The ocean became a place of endless motion, where every drop held the possibility of something more. Over time, these molecules formed chains. They folded into shapes. They formed boundaries around themselves. They created tiny walls that separated inside from outside. And in doing so, they took the first step toward life. The first cells were simple beyond imagining. No eyes, no mouths, no limbs, no thoughts, just soft membranes floating in water, carrying the spark of replication. They fed on the chemicals around them. They broke down energy from the Earth's heat. They grew and divided and drifted with the current. They did not speak or move or build, but they endured. And that endurance was everything. These first living things changed the world in ways they could not know. As they multiplied, they consumed and released. Some of them began to use light, not the way we do, but by absorbing sunlight and turning it into energy. This simple act, known as photosynthesis, would become one of the most important processes in Earth's history because it released a gas that had not yet existed in the atmosphere: oxygen. At first, oxygen was a poison to most of the cells that lived in the sea. Many of them died when the gas began to rise, but others adapted. They learned to use oxygen to release more energy. They became stronger, more stable. They formed new structures, and the oxygen they released changed the sky. Over millions of years, the oxygen levels rose. The blue of the sky became brighter. The clouds turned softer. The planet began to glow, not just with water, but with air. The atmosphere thickened with breathable gas. A protective layer formed high above the clouds, a shield of ozone that blocked the most harmful rays of sunlight. The Earth had learned how to protect itself, and that protection made space for life to grow. At the same time, the continents began to rise. Land pushed upward from beneath the sea. Islands formed and collided and formed again. These pieces of crust gathered and stretched. They became the first large landmasses, primitive continents with no trees or grass or animals, just rock and wind and time. But they changed the planet's shape. They created coastlines. They guided rivers. They gave the atmosphere new places to interact with. As the land rose, it cooled the air above it. Winds began to flow differently. Weather patterns formed. Rain fell on dry ground and carved out valleys. It filled lakes and cut canyons. It carried minerals from rock to sea. And as these elements mixed, they created new conditions for life. The cycle of land and water and air had begun, and it never stopped. Some of the early life remained in the ocean. Others clung to rocks in shallow pools. Some adapted to new environments and began to change shape. The cells that once floated alone began to form colonies. They worked together. They shared tasks. They communicated through chemicals. These partnerships led to greater complexity. And over millions of years, the first eukaryotic cells appeared. Cells with a nucleus. Cells that would eventually build all plants and animals and people. The Earth was now breathing in cycles. The oceans released moisture into the sky. Clouds formed and rain fell. The land released heat into the air. The wind carried dust and seed. The moon continued to guide the tides, and all of it moved in rhythm. A quiet unfolding of life. What had once been fire was now water. What had once been silence was now breath. The world that began in molten chaos had become a planet of soft rhythms and slow transformation. Life had found a foothold. The air had changed. The land had lifted. The sea had opened its arms to something new. And through it all, the Earth never rushed. It did not force or demand. It only moved. It only breathed. It only continued. The making of Earth was not a single event. It was a long, patient shaping of stone and sea and sky, a gentle guidance of molecules into meaning, a quiet rhythm of fire becoming life, and in that rhythm we are still moving. Life began in silence, with no eyes to witness it and no voice to name it. For billions of years, Earth was home only to the small and the soft. Microbes drifting in oceans, floating near the warmth of volcanic vents, or clinging to rocks just beneath the surface. These were the earliest forms of life, simple, single, ancient. But from their stillness came everything that followed. At first, they existed alone, independent cells, feeding and dividing. Some used heat to survive, others learned to use light. A few began to build structures within themselves, organizing their parts into something stronger. These were the eukaryotic cells. They carried within them a small blueprint of potential, a promise of complexity, a whisper of future creatures not yet imagined. Time stretched forward slowly, not in days or years, but in eons. Millions of years passed while the planet remained quiet above and alive below. The oceans held these tiny forms in endless numbers. They multiplied, they competed, they adapted, and as they did, the chemistry of the planet changed. Oxygen filled the sea and rose into the sky. The air became breathable. The surface became brighter. The sea more dynamic. Then something changed. A partnership was formed between cells. Not a battle, not a dominance, but a union. Two types of simple life joined together, one living inside the other. They began to function as one. This moment was not loud or fast, but it marked a turning point in the history of life. It led to the first multicellular organisms, life that was not just one cell but many cells, working together, coordinated, connected, capable of growth in new directions. These early multicellular creatures were soft and small. They had no bones, no shells, no spines, but they moved. They sensed light. They began to form shapes that could respond to the world. Spirals, tubes, discs. Some floated, others clung to surfaces. They lived in shallow seas where light could reach them and the tides could guide them. In this ancient ocean, Earth became a workshop of life. Currents stirred nutrients, tides carved patterns, volcanoes released minerals, the continents continued to drift, mountains rose and wore down again, rain carried sediment to the sea. All of this created the perfect laboratory, a place of endless repetition and quiet transformation. The first animals were simple, flat bodies, no heads, no legs, just forms that could move with the water. But they sensed the world. They responded to heat, to light, to touch. They began to move not only with the current, but with intention, toward food, away from harm. They were learning what it meant to exist. The Cambrian period arrived, and with it came the explosion of forms. Life branched into countless shapes, hard shells, jointed legs, spines, mouths, eyes. Earth was now filled with movement and color beneath the sea. Trilobites crawled along the ocean floor. Jellyfish drifted like ghosts. Worms burrowed through soft sand. Coral colonies built quiet forests in the shallows. The world had awakened. This burst of diversity happened over millions of years. Each form tested by time, some vanished, others evolved. The earth itself responded. As oxygen levels rose, creatures grew larger. As the continents shifted, ecosystems changed. Where shallow seas once stood, mountains emerged. Where warm waters once nurtured reefs, cold currents brought silence. But life always returned in new shapes, new rhythms. Even plants began to appear. Tiny algae floating in the sea, simple strands clinging to rocks. They too used light. They too released oxygen. They fed the world from below, and from their quiet work the foundation of food chains was built. One life fed another, and the circle began. There were no forests yet, no animals on land, but in the sea life had learned how to grow, how to build, how to move, and how to remember. Through all of it, the moon continued to circle the earth. The tides shaped the coastlines, the water breathed in and out, and with each breath, life changed a little more. The deep time of life is not marked by clocks. It is marked by layers of stone, by fossils pressed into sediment, by molecules passed from one generation to the next. It is marked by patience, by repetition, by failure and renewal, and by motion that never truly ends. You are made from this motion, from cells that learned to divide, from oceans that learned to carry breath, from stardust that learned to become aware, and the story is still unfolding. For a long time, life remained in the sea, held by the comfort of water and the rhythm of tides. But the land was rising, slowly, quietly, piece by piece. The continents were forming. Massive blocks of crust collided and lifted. Mountains grew. Valleys stretched between them. The wind shaped their faces. Rain carved their slopes. Rivers carried their dust back to the sea. The surface of the earth was taking shape, and it waited for life to follow. The land was harsh. There was no soil, no shade, no protection, just rock and dust and wind. The sunlight was strong, the air was thin, and the earth's surface baked under the quiet fire of day. But some life had already begun to test the edges. Cyanobacteria clung to damp stones near the shore. Algae formed mats in tidal pools. They were small and simple, but they opened the door. The ocean had made them, and now they were exploring the space beyond. The first to truly hold the land were plants, not trees or flowers or anything with leaves, but soft, moss-like forms that spread across moist ground. They used sunlight to grow. They released oxygen, they trapped dust, they broke down rock, and in doing so they began to create the first soil. A thin layer of life above the stone, fragile but persistent. These early plants spread slowly. They reached a little farther each season. Their roots grew deeper. Their spores drifted on the wind. And as they grew, they changed the land. Soil thickened. Water gathered in pools. The ground softened. The atmosphere filled with more oxygen. The conditions for more complex life were taking shape. In time, plants developed stronger stems. They grew taller. They formed veins to carry water. They built structures to support leaves. Ferns appeared, horsetails, spore-bearing plants that reached higher than the moss before them. The land was no longer empty. It was beginning to breathe, but plants did not arrive alone. Tiny animals followed. Insects with armor-like shells, worms that burrowed into the new soil, millipedes that fed on decaying plant matter. These creatures lived close to the ground. They crawled and crept and explored, and in their footsteps the land began to change again. Over millions of years, these first forests grew denser. Trees evolved, roots spread wider, trunks rose higher. Leaves reached toward the sun. The air grew more humid. Rainfall increased. The forest floor darkened under the canopy. Microclimates formed, and the land became more than surface. It became a system. These early forests were not like those of today. The trees had no flowers. The leaves were simple. The growth was slow, but they were alive and they were vast. And they carried something new into the earth: permanence. Roots that held the land in place. Branches that shaped the wind. Canopies that filtered sunlight. The face of the earth was covered not just in stone and dust, but in green dot. As the forests grew, the air transformed. Oxygen levels rose. The sky cleared. Fires became possible. Weather patterns shifted. The earth's temperature found a balance. And all the while, the moon pulled at the tides and the continents drifted across the globe. The rhythm of the world was deepening. Beneath the forests and in the swamps and rivers, new animals evolved. Amphibians that could breathe both water and air. Creatures with legs instead of fins. The first vertebrates. Their arrival marked the beginning of a new chapter. One where movement was not limited to the sea. One where bones carried bodies across the surface of the earth. The journey had taken hundreds of millions of years, from microbes in the ocean, to moss on stone, to trees that touched the sky, from soft-bodied creatures drifting with currents, two-legged animals walking through ferns. But it had never stopped. Each step had built the next. Each change had invited another. The land that had once been fire was now forest. The sky that had once been smoke was now air. The sea that had once been lava was now life. The earth had made itself ready. Slowly, patiently, completely, and still it turned. Under the light of the same moon, around the warmth of the same sun. With tides that whispered the memory of all that had come before. The earth never stopped moving, even when it seemed quiet. Beneath the forests and oceans, the surface of the planet continued to drift. The continents were not fixed. They floated on vast plates of rock, moved by currents deep within the mantle. This slow, steady motion, known as plate tectonics, shaped the face of the earth without sound or hurry. At times, the plates pulled away from each other. New crust rose from beneath the sea, forming ridges that stretched like seams across the ocean floor. At other times, they collided. One plate would slide beneath another, and mountains would rise. These collisions were not sudden. They took millions of years, but their results were immense. They lifted land. They folded rock. They created ranges that touched the sky. The Himalayas formed this way. As two continents pushed together, so did the Andes and the Rockies. Each range tells the story of ancient movement. Each peak carries the memory of pressure and fire and time. And as mountains rose, they changed everything around them. They altered wind patterns. They cast shadows that shaped deserts. They captured rain and gave birth to rivers. Their presence redirected life. Oceans, too, were reshaped by this movement. New basins opened as land pulled apart. Old seas closed as continents joined. The Atlantic Ocean was once a narrow rift, but it grew wider each year. The Pacific has grown smaller. The land and sea are partners in a dance that never ends. Always drifting, always returning, always rearranging the boundaries of the world. These movements shaped climate as well. As continents shifted toward or away from the equator, their weather changed. Warm, shallow seas once filled the interiors of landmasses. Coral reefs grew far from today's tropical zones. Rainforests thrived where deserts now exist. Ice spread across land that was once green. Every shift in the Earth's crust brought new challenges and new opportunities for life. the plants and animals that had taken hold on land learned to adapt to these changes. Some followed the warmth, others adapted to cold. Some grew larger, some vanished. Evolution responded not only to time but to place. Mountains isolated species, oceans separated continents. The movement of the planet shaped not just geography, but biology. At times the drifting of continents created supercontinents. All the land gathered into one vast mass. One such supercontinent was called Pangaea. It stretched from pole to pole and was surrounded by a vast global ocean. For a time, life flourished in its interior. Forests spread across its surface. Rivers crossed thousands of miles. But the climate grew harsh in the center. Dry winds, wide deserts, shallow seas that vanished with each rise and fall of the land. Eventually, Pangaea began to break apart. Cracks opened. Lava rose. Oceans returned to separate the land once more. New continents formed and drifted away. North and South America, Africa, Eurasia, Antarctica, Australia. Their shapes were different then, their positions unfamiliar. But the Earth was finding a balance between unity and division, between gathering and release. This movement continues even now. The continents are still drifting. Mountains are still rising. The seafloor is still expanding. We walk on land that floats. We live on plates that move. And though the motion is slow, it never stops. The Earth is a living planet, not because it breathes in the way we do, but because it moves and changes and remembers. The sky above these shifting lands held its own patterns. As the continents drifted, the climate followed. Warm periods and ice ages came and went. Glaciers formed and melted. Oceans rose and fell, and each cycle left marks on the land. Valleys carved by ice, shorelines far from today's sea, fossils of marine life on mountaintops. These are not accidents. They are the signatures of a planet in motion. And through it all, the moon continued its pull, guiding tides, slowing Earth's spin, holding the rhythm steady while the surface changed. The moon has no control over the movement of plates, but its presence keeps the Earth stable. It calms the tilt of the planet. It helps preserve the seasons. It gives the world time to evolve slowly rather than spin into chaos. The dance of continents is slow and deep. It cannot be heard, it cannot be felt, but it holds everything we know, every mountain, every ocean, every place we have ever called home. And it reminds us that change is not a mistake. It is a law. The Earth moves not to escape, but to grow. Not to erase, but to begin again. In this motion, we find meaning. In this drifting, we find direction. And in the rise and fall of stone, we see the slow unfolding of time. The land had risen, and the continents had drifted. Mountains touched the sky, and oceans filled their basins. The Earth had shaped itself into valleys and ridges and plains, but something was still missing, something that would turn bare stone into shelter, that would soften the wind and feed the sky, that would make the land come alive with breath and shade and stillness. That something was the forest. The first trees were not like the ones we know today. They had no flowers. Their leaves were simple. Their roots shallow, but they were tall and they were patient. They rose slowly from the damp ground in places where water was near and the soil had formed thick enough to hold them. These early forests stretched across ancient continents like quiet oceans of green. They filled the air with oxygen. They cooled the land. They gave shelter to the growing life that followed them. The trunks were wide and wooden. The branches spread into light. The roots reached down into the dark. They pulled water from the soil and minerals from the stone. They held the land in place and shaped the flow of rivers. They absorbed carbon from the sky and changed the balance of the atmosphere. Forests were not just plants. They were systems. They were lungs. They were memory. The air became richer. The skies clearer. The earth's temperature softened. The forests turned sunlight into energy. They fed insects and fungi and animals. They dropped leaves that became soil. They built layers of life above and below. Insects crawled through bark. Small reptiles rested on low branches. Amphibians laid their eggs in quiet ponds beneath the shade. Everything depended on the forest's rhythm, the slow growth, the seasonal change, the silent endurance. Over time, trees became more complex. They grew higher. They spread wider. Their roots held entire hillsides. Their fallen trunks fed generations of new life. Some began to form seeds. Some grew cones. Some dropped spores that drifted on the wind. They adapted to fire, to drought, to cold, to each other. And the forests became more than green. They became diverse. They became ancient. Some trees lived for hundreds of years, some for thousands. Their rings held stories of storm and sun. Their shadows stretched across entire ecosystems. Birds nested in their limbs. Mammals took shelter in their hollows. And beneath them, the forest floor grew dark and soft and full of hidden life. Roots intertwined. Fungi formed networks. Nutrients moved in silence. The forest was not still. It was always changing, always communicating, always breathing. In the fossil record, these forests are preserved in stone, trunks turned to mineral, leaves pressed into shale, pollen trapped in amber. They tell the story of a time when Earth learned to grow upward, when life reached for the sun and turned the sky into a canopy, when breath did not just fill the lungs of animals, but the air itself. The forests shaped the path of evolution, offered food and cover and challenge. Animals grew legs strong enough to climb, eyes sharp enough to see through dappled light, ears tuned to the rustle of leaves. Life began to fill the land, not just with motion, but with relationship, predator and prey, plant and pollinator, seed and soil. The forest became a teacher. Seasons began to define the year. Leaves changed color and fell. Branches grew bare and then green again. Migration patterns followed these changes. Reproduction was timed with them. Life aligned itself with the rhythm of trees, and the forests adapted to snow and rain, to wind and drought, to the slow pull of time and the rising curve of mountains. Even fire became part of the forest's story. Some trees needed it. Their seeds would only open with heat. Their bark was thick enough to survive. The flames cleared space for new growth. The ashes fed the next generation. Destruction became a part of creation, and the forests learned how to begin again. Through all of this, the continents continued to move. The forests followed them, growing in new places, retreating from others. They crossed what would become deserts, climbed what would become mountains. sank into swamps, and returned to dry land. Their memory was not held in thought, but in seed, in pattern, in persistence, and always the earth turned beneath the moon. The tides rose and fell. The rain gathered and returned. The forests drank from clouds and fed the soil. The cycle remained. Growth and fall, light and dark, breath and stillness. Forests were not the beginning of life, but they were the beginning of something deeper, a network, a structure, a language written not in sound, but in space, a place where time could unfold with softness and power, where silence was not absence, but presence. To walk through a forest even now is to step into that memory, into that breath, into that long, slow rhythm. The forests had spread across the continents, and the world was green and alive, but the earth was not done changing. Its path around the sun was steady, but not perfect. The planet tilted and wobbled and shifted over long periods of time. These slow changes altered the climate, and the world grew cold. Ice began to gather at the poles, and then stretch downward toward the equator. This was the beginning of an ice age. Not a single winter, but a pattern of cold that would last for millions of years. The oceans pulled back as more water froze into glaciers. Sea levels dropped. Land bridges formed between continents. The world that had once been soft and humid now held ice that cracked mountains and carved valleys. Sheets of frozen water moved slowly across the surface of the earth, grinding down everything in their path. The landscape was scraped and shaped by silence. Deep fjords were formed. Great lakes were carved. Entire forests disappeared beneath the weight of snow. But life did not vanish. It changed. It followed the cold, or adapted to it. In the shadows of glaciers, animals grew larger. Their bodies held more heat. Their coats became thicker. Their feet broader. Mammoths roamed in great herds across frozen plains. Giant sloths moved through southern forests. Saber-toothed cats hunted beneath the shadows of ice. These animals were shaped by the cold. They survived by strength and memory and migration. Plants changed too. Trees that could not endure the frost moved south. Some waited underground for centuries until the ice passed. Grasses took over the open land. Shrubs clung to rocky slopes. Tundra stretched across continents like a quiet sea. The green world had turned pale, but it still lived. The skies during the Ice Age were heavy with clouds. Snow fell for months at a time. Storms moved slowly and covered vast distances. The air was sharp and dry. The seasons were long. The earth had shifted into a slower rhythm, one shaped by glacier and wind and time. Yet even during this cold chapter, warmth would return. The earth cycled between colder and warmer phases. Glaciers advanced and retreated. Rivers changed direction. Lakes appeared and vanished. The animals moved with these rhythms. They learned to read the signs, to feel the change in the air, to follow the sun as it shifted through the years. These changes were not global all at once. Some parts of the earth remained warm and wet. Forests still stood near the equator. Life flourished in pockets and edges. The diversity of the planet increased. Species adapted to specific climates. Some stayed in the warmth. Others braved the cold. Evolution worked quietly with every snowfall. The continents continued to drift even through the ice. Their positions influenced the movement of air and water. Currents shifted, mountains redirected storms. Volcanic eruptions sometimes darkened the sky and cooled the world even further. But the earth always responded, always rebalanced, always moved forward. It was during these long cold periods that the human story began, not with cities or tools or language, but with quiet footsteps across frozen ground. Our earliest ancestors walked among mammoths. They lived in caves. They watched the sky for signs of change. Their lives were shaped by the cold and by the movement of herds and the opening of rivers and the retreat of ice. They learned to make fire, to build shelter, to follow the seasons, and slowly they spread across the continents. Their journey was not one of conquest, but of endurance. They moved because the earth moved. They survived because they adapted. Their presence became part of the planet's rhythm. As the Ice Age neared its end, the glaciers melted, the oceans rose again, forests returned, rivers changed their paths, and the memory of ice remained in the land, in the rocks, in the fossils, in the blood of the animals that once roamed free. Today we still see the traces in the shape of the land, in the depth of the lakes, in the curve of valleys. The earth remembers. It holds the memory of cold in its bones, and we carry that memory too. The age of ice was not an interruption. It was part of the story. A long, slow breath that reshaped the world, that tested life, that taught adaptation, that prepared the planet for what would come next. The glaciers retreated, the sky grew warmer, the forests spread once more, and in that warmth something new would rise. The earth had warmed again, the glaciers melted, rivers flowed faster, forests returned to the valleys, the air was richer, the land more open, and in this new world the human journey began, not with thunder or light, but with footsteps, bare and quiet, moving across soil that had once been covered in ice. The first people were not builders, they were walkers. They moved with the herds, they followed the water. They learned the shapes of trees and the sounds of birds. They felt the seasons before. They knew how to name them. They were not separate from the earth. They were made of it. And the land guided them like a memory held in stone. They watched the stars. They listened to the wind. They learned to read the sky for signs of rain. They remembered where the rivers curved, where the berries grew, where the caves stayed dry through winter. Their knowledge was quiet, passed not through books, but through hands and firelight and rhythm. And fire became their voice. It had always been part of the planet. Fire had risen from volcanoes and spread through lightning strikes. It had burned forests and reshaped land. But now it was held in human hands. It gave warmth, it cooked food, it lit the darkness, it kept predators away. It made the night a place of gathering, of stories, of breath. Fire turned the world inward. Around it, people sat, faces glowing, shadows dancing, words spoken softly, knowledge shared. The spark passed from one generation to the next, not just of how to survive, but of how to understand. The moon continued to guide the tides, but fire began to guide the mind. The people began to change the land. Slowly, they burned fields to bring new growth. They carved stone. They followed animals across continents. They crossed rivers. They reached mountains. They reached islands. Over thousands of years, humans moved into every part of the world, not to conquer it, but to live within it. They began to paint, not just for beauty, but to remember. Shapes of animals, of mystery, they carved into stone what they felt in silence. They built not to dominate, but to dwell, and their homes followed the land's rhythm. Some stayed where the rivers ran wide. They learned to grow grain, to plant seeds, to wait for the rains. Others followed the ocean. They built boats from bark. They crossed to new shores. They fished with their hands. They told stories of stars reflected in the waves. In every part of the world, humans became part of the place. Their bodies adapted to heat and cold. Their languages changed with the wind. Their customs reflected the seasons. Their songs carried the sound of the land, and always the fire burned. It burned in hearths, in fields, in hearts. It was not only heat, it was memory. It was a signal that someone was there, that someone had returned, that someone was watching the same sky and listening to the same earth. As time passed, people gathered in larger groups. They built walls, roads, markets, temples. They shaped metal, formed letters, measured time, watched the moon not only for rhythm but for meaning. They named constellations. They told stories of creation and destruction. They wrote the sky into myth. But even as the world grew louder, some part of the old still remained. The way fire flickered in silence, the way water moved under moonlight, the way forests spoke with wind, the way mountains remembered, and through it all, the earth continued to turn. The moon continued to circle. The tides rose and fell, and humanity stood between sky and soil, listening with open hands. We are not separate from this planet. We are its children, its breath, its long dream made visible. We came from water and fire, from wind and dust, from memory that was never ours alone. And even now, beneath all the noise of modern life, the fire still burns, the earth still turns, and the old rhythms still carry us forward. The earth is old beyond memory. It has carried oceans and fire and forests and ice. It has turned beneath storms and stars. It has held the quiet of stone and the motion of breath. But it also remembers, not in words, not in thought, but in shape, in layer, in silence. The earth remembers through the lines etched into its body. Mountains rise and fall, but they leave behind their bones. Ridges carved by glaciers, peaks sharpened by wind, valleys softened by rain. Each one tells the story of pressure and uplift and erosion. Each fold of rock is a sentence written in time, a story that begins deep beneath the surface and ends in the clouds. Some mountains grow faster than others, pushed upward by the meeting of continents, carved by the slow grinding of plates. They do not move quickly, but they never stop. They shift by inches, by fractions, and over millions of years they become giants. The Himalayas, the Andes, the Rockies, each one holds the memory of fire and stone, of creation through collision. Other places remember through absence, through the wide circle of a crater, through the sudden silence left behind by impact. Meteorites have struck the earth many times. Some left no trace, others changed everything. The largest ones released energy greater than anything else the planet has ever known. They reshaped continents, boiled oceans, shifted the climate, and left behind scars that still hold their shape. The earth carries these scars without shame. It does not heal by hiding. It heals by holding, by letting the mark become part of the pattern, part of the whole. Craters fill with water, valleys grow green again. Fire becomes soil, silence becomes life. Nothing is erased. Everything becomes beneath the surface. The memory is deeper still. Layers of rock lie stacked one atop the other. Each layer a different world. Some formed beneath the sea, others under. Forests, some pressed by glaciers, others baked by sun. Within them are fossils, shells turned to stone, leaves pressed flat, bones of creatures that no longer breathe, but through them the past speaks. Paleontologists read these layers like pages. They listen for the rhythm of extinction and rebirth. They see where the oceans rose and where they fell. They find the ash of ancient eruptions, the soot of distant fires. The record is incomplete, but never silent. The earth does not forget, it only buries, and in time reveals, even the deserts. Remember, dunes shaped by winds that have long since changed direction. Stones worn smooth by rivers that no longer run. The silence of these places is not empty. It is full of history, full of waiting, full of the long breath of time. Volcanoes, too, are destroyed cities, fed forests with ash. Their eruptions are sudden, but their presence is ancient. They are reminders that the earth is alive, that it still changes, that beneath calm surfaces motion remains. Earthquakes shift the land in moments, but the pressure behind them builds over centuries. A reminder that even the smallest crack may hold the weight of 1,000 years. A long conversation between water and stone, between sky and crust, between force and rest. The continents have danced across the globe. The poles have wandered. The seafloor has opened and closed. The planet has turned without pause through all of it. Time is written into its curves, its layers, its textures. In every canyon, every plain, every ridge, we walk across history each time we touch the ground. The sand beneath our feet may once have been mountain. The rock beside a stream may once have been ocean floor. The air we breathe may carry particles from forests long gone. We are not separate from this memory. We carry it in our bones, in our blood, in the water we drink, in the stone we build with, in the stories we tell around fire. The earth does not rush. It remembers in slow shapes, in quiet weight, in the stillness of hills and the curve of rivers. And if we listen, if we walk softly, if we rest our hands on the surface of the land, we can feel that memory moving through us too. The earth has never stopped becoming. From the first dust that circled the young star to the blue and green world we know today, it has always been in motion, always folding, always rising, always turning. The story of Earth is not a story of what was. It is a story of what is, what continues, what breathes beneath your feet every moment you are alive. The continents are still drifting. Each year they move just a little. The ocean floor still spreads apart at the mid-Atlantic ridge. Volcanoes still rise from the sea in quiet eruptions that build new land. Earthquakes shift the surface in sudden jolts that echo with ancient pressure. Rivers still carve valleys. Winds still shape dunes. Ice still scrapes the edges of high peaks. The planet never sleeps. Above the land, the atmosphere swirls, storms gather and pass. Jet streams carry moisture and heat. Rain falls into mountains and flows down into rivers that return to the sea. Clouds are pulled by invisible hands across continents. The air we breathe is the same air that moved through forests thousands of years ago, the same oxygen released by ancient trees, the same moisture that once touched the skin of the first mammals. The sky is a mirror of the past in motion. The oceans remain vast and deep. They hold warmth. They carry currents that circle the planet. They move energy from equator to pole and back again. Beneath their surface, coral reefs still grow. Whales still follow ancient paths. Microscopic life still drifts on invisible tides. The sea is not separate from the land. It shapes the wind. It balances the climate. It gives the earth its voice. Even the moon still plays its part. It pulls on the oceans, slows the spin of the earth, holds the planet's tilt steady so that seasons continue. Without the moon, the rhythm would change. The balance would shift, but it remains quiet and watchful. A partner in the great turning. Beneath the surface of the earth, the mantle still moves. Convection currents rise and fall. Heat from the core travels upward. Plates are pushed and pulled. Volcanoes form. Trenches deepen. Mountains rise. This motion is not something we see each day, but it is always there. The earth is not a finished shape. It is a slow sculpture still forming, and on its surface we live. We walk, we build, we remember. Every city rests on ancient stones. Every step touches ground that has seen oceans and glaciers and forests. Every breath carries particles from volcanoes and stars and seeds. We are not above the earth. We are made of it. The food we eat comes from soil. The water we drink flows through mountains. The heat that warms us once came from the sun, filtered through forests and fields. The minerals in our tools were pulled from the bones of the earth. The rhythm of our days follows the turning of the planet. The rhythm of our lives follows its seasons. We shape the world now too. Our buildings rise like cliffs. Our roads stretch like rivers. Our lights reach into the night sky. Our hands dig and plant and carry. We change the earth just as it changes us. And with this power comes the need to listen, to learn, to remember, because the earth is not a machine. It is not fixed. It is alive in the way only something vast and ancient can be. It has moods, patterns, memories. It can endure and adapt, but it is not infinite. Its balance is delicate. Its beauty is slow. Its gifts are quiet. And in this moment, the earth is still becoming. Forests grow. Deserts shift. Ice melts. Species move. The climate warms. The oceans rise. The wind carries new patterns. The sky reflects our choices. But even now, in the face of change, the earth offers rhythm. Tides still flow. Seeds still sprout. Rain still falls. Life still finds a way to continue. We are living in a world that is not finished. We are part of a story that is still being written. We are walking through a landscape shaped by stars and storms and silence. And every breath we take is part of that long unfolding. The earth is not just our home. It is our origin, our mirror, our memory. It is the dust that became stone, the fire that became light, the silence that became sound. And it continues. With or without us, it will move forward. But with us, it can become something more. Not only beautiful, but conscious. Not only alive, but understood. And in the quiet turning of night into day, in the soft rise of wind across the hills, in the gentle tide returning to shore, we can still hear the voice of the earth becoming